to thank the Chamber for hosting this debate. Tom, our moderators and hosts, and Congressman Himes for your time on today's very important discussion. Social Security and Medicare. First on Social Security, I think Simpson-Bowles has really provided a bipartisan framework by which we can approach Social Security. And in that, I think we've reached into many of the levers that have been put out in the framework, and now it's down to Congress to sit down in a bipartisan fashion and address it in terms of how do we deal with eligibility age, how do we deal with benefits and so forth, because all these problems, whether we like them or not, are bipartisan problems that require bipartisan solutions. So I support Simpson-Bowles from a Social Security standpoint. From a standpoint of Medicare, the first thing we have to do with Medicare is stop the scare tactics. We have to stop the scare tactics. Because solving Medicare, it is a bipartisan problem, and it requires a bipartisan solution. So first of all, we have to preserve Medicare for people currently in the system and for future generations. So first, people over 55 years, we have to give them the security that that program will be in place. Second of all, we have to address our healthcare costs. We're on a path of unsustainability for healthcare in general without that. And finally, we need to recognize that waste, fraud, and abuse, although a short-term issue, needs to be addressed, and I've put forward very specific issues where credit card technology can be used to address it.
Mr. Himes.
Tom, thank you. And I'd also like to thank you, and I'd like to thank all of the sponsors of today's debate and our panelists and my opponent, Mr. Obsitnik. It's wonderful that you turned out to hear this debate. I'm glad for the question because the question is really at the core of balancing our books in this country. We spend a lot of time talking about earmarks and this and that. Medicare in particular is absolutely critical. The unfunded liabilities associated with Medicare are 3 times the size of the debt that we carry today, and it's a much thornier problem than simply moving the taxes and spending that we would need to move to address the budget. So let me start with Social Security. Social Security is less complicated to fix. We did it in 1986 when Ronald Reagan was president through a combination of raising the cap above which wages are no longer withheld and very carefully and slowly moving the Retirement Age Act out. Mr. Obsitnik referred to Simpson-Bowles, which is a plan that has an idea like in that I've spent 2 years pushing very, very hard in the United States Congress for the acceptance of that as a model for how we get our fiscal house in order. Medicare is much more complicated. Medicare, of course, sits on top of an enormously expensive and enormously inefficient healthcare system, which delivers good results to people who have access to it, but which spends 2 times per person what any other industrial country spends on healthcare and delivers, on average, worse results. That inefficiency must be extracted from the system. That's how we fix it. Not by vouchers, not by capping the amount of support we give to our seniors, but by getting at that inefficiency.
Mr. Obsitnik, you have 45 seconds.
Thank you. I think Congressman Himes and I really agree, I think, from the framework on Social Security. Medicare, I think, is very important. Congressman Himes, when he was in the Norwalk Senior Center a few months ago, basically said, and I quote, "I'm supposed to tell you Paul Ryan's plan is going to eliminate Medicare as you know it. That is not true. That is not true." Today, there was a press release that Congressman Himes put out that said it will decimate the future of Medicare. We might have to get a third podium up here if we have rooms to have Congressman Himes debate with candidate Himes what is his position on Medicare.
Ken Dixon, your question for Mr. Himes.
Speaking of stopping the scare tactics, we all get releases from the various political parties during the week, and this offer is from the National Republican Campaign Committee. How will Himes defend his healthcare takeover that already cost $27.6 billion and destroyed 18,000 jobs?
Well, I'm not in the habit of defending the barbed political attacks that come out of the NRCC or, frankly, out of the political arm of my own party. It is an unfortunate consequence of the season that we're in. Look, healthcare reform, which, of course, and my opponent kindly said we should stop the scare tactics. Remember who started these scare tactics with respect to healthcare reform? Death panels that prevented us from really moving forward on some important things. The concept of a government takeover of healthcare. Folks, the insurance companies are now going to have 30 more million clients because those people will be added to the system. Those are private health insurance companies. Private doctors, of course, will continue to act the way they do, and hospitals will remain private. There is no government takeover of healthcare. What there is, for the first time in 75 years, we made a very serious effort to cover 30 million, 40 million Americans who to date have had no other access to our healthcare system but to go to an emergency room. And if your wife is diagnosed with breast cancer, you don't want her being treated in an emergency room. It reformed the insurance industry so that never again will an insurance company tell you that because you have diabetes, you are uninsurable and you're on your own. It said to our seniors, the preventive care, the annual physical that you get will now be without copay so that you go do it. You will no longer fall into the donut hole, which is a moment when seniors are paying thousands of dollars for their prescriptions. We have work to do on healthcare. We must continue to reduce the cost of that system to get at the Medicare challenge that we all know to be so important.
Mr. Obsitnik.
We all want quality healthcare for people. We really do, and I think that's a bipartisan answer, which the question is, how do we afford it? The problem I think people don't have healthcare is it's been too expensive. I've been a small businessman for 16 years. I'm not allowed to pool my people's interests across 5 states. That makes it expensive for me because I look like 5 really small businesses. I have a pre-existing condition, my daughter does, people here have one. I teach entrepreneurship at Sacred Heart. There are kids coming out of college, 26, that don't have jobs, and that's another topic we'll talk about. And there are some important things which we can work on, but a one-size-fits-all government solution like No Child Left Behind or the VA hospital, which has been not taking care of our veterans the way I believe we should, is not the path forward. It was the wrong time and the wrong approach. The wrong time, people were hurting job-wise. We have a 9%, 8.9% unemployment rate right now, which we should have been addressing. So specifically, we need to talk about access, quality control, and cost. In the interest of time, I hope we can get back to that, because I think that those are the 3 fundamental levers which we need to empower ourselves to answer. Thank you.
Mr. Himes, 45 seconds for rebuttal.
I don't know at a moment in time when millions of Americans lost their jobs and therefore lost their health insurance, as began to occur in 2008 and occurred through 2009. I don't know how in a system that allows tens of thousands of Americans to die every year because they don't have access to health care, I don't know how it could possibly be the wrong time to fix a system that has devastated so many lives. What I will tell you is that we have taken some very big strides in a more equitable, better system that means that Americans won't wake up thinking, I may not have access to care when I need it. Yes, we have work yet to do. I referred to the increase in the cost in the system. The healthcare reform didn't go far enough on that. We need to continue to focus on that, and that will allow us to have a fair, accessible, and equitable system.
Patrick Gallagher, your question for Mr. Obsitnik.
Mr. Obsitnik, you say that we need a bipartisan solution to address Social Security and Medicare. How do you rise above the deadlock that has plagued Congress, and how do you try to change the tone and bring some more action rather than this back and forth?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the Navy, I learned one thing. I served 9 years in the U.S. Navy. And what you learn more important than anything else is to lead by example. And it's the example that you set in all aspects of your life, where either people follow you or you don't follow people. You solve problems with that example or you don't. So my example, I think that we've seen in Washington, when people vote with their party 95% of the time and demagogue the other side and then expect to sit down and do a deal with that person. I don't think Alan Simpson or Erskine Bowles were talking with the rhetoric to frame Simpson Bowles. I've done business and done deals in 19 countries. I don't walk in and demagogue my opponents. It's about long-term relationships. So my example is to go really an inch wide and a mile deep on big bipartisan problems. Medicare fraud, 50 to $100 billion waste. I've talked to people about how we can just do something as easy as credit card technology to attack Medicare fraud. That's bipartisan. And you know what? I'm going to walk the walk because I think the cholesterol in Washington is that we have career politicians. I'm a career leader. That's why personally, my example, if you believe it, is 4 terms, 8 years in Congress, if I'm so lucky. So I lead by example. I will not be, beholden to a party. I will not be beholden to a lobbyist. I will be beholden to you if I'm so lucky. Thanks,
Mr. Himes.
I agree that leading by example is critical, and if you talk to anybody in the Congress of the United States, they will identify me as a guy who operates in a bipartisan way. The I managed to pass a bill on the floor of the House of Representatives in this Congress, Republican-dominated House, and that was written by me and by a freshman Republican, because I think it's critical that we reach across the aisle. I recently got, just yesterday, actually, No Labels, an organization that is urging bipartisanship. I got their tag as a problem solver, as a guy who steps away from partisanship. By contrast, Mr. Obsitnik, watch the TV ads. He's calling me Wall Street Jim, riding around in limos. Last time I rode in a limo was when I was married 18 years ago. There was an attack yesterday where some company that got some money from the Department of Energy went bankrupt, as some companies will, and there was this incredible attack about how my pet company went under, and this is Jim Himes' thing. Steve Obsitnik, when he was CEO of Quintel, took $4 million of government money, of taxpayer funds, to help his company put jobs in Rochester, New York. And yet yesterday we see a press release saying Jim Himes' pet company, because he wants to pick winners and losers, went under, and it's his fault. That is not leading by example.
Mr. Obsitnik, 45.
Well, obviously, Governor Cuomo knows a winner. And we'll get back to that. Because obviously, Governor Malloy didn't. So what we're going to hear is from Congressman Himes, things are complex. I've talked to a lot of people. I've had a lot of meetings. I get a lot of awards. You know what? Last time I checked, trophies don't solve problems. Action does. So if you want to write down on your paper in front of you how many times he says complex, how many meetings he's had, it hasn't helped the facts. We have 9% of people unemployed in the state, 23 million people in this country. Gas prices up in Ridgefield last night, $4.39. I'm sorry, the policies have failed, and you deserve better.
Jared Ferrari for Jim Himes.
Thank you. Congressman Himes, the real estate crisis is still very real for many in Connecticut. What, if anything, do you plan to do to reboot conditions for homeowners still underwater?
It's a really critical question. There's not a day when I'm not in one of my offices in either Bridgeport or Stamford where somebody doesn't come in and say, I'm about to lose my home. And this has been true for the last 4 years because of the disaster we went through in 2008. And by the way, it's important to our economy as well. The Federal Reserve, others tell us that one of the single biggest reasons for our economic recovery being a lot slower than we would like it is because Americans are still insecure about the value of their house and whether they're underwater in their mortgage. So I think part of continuing to push this recovery, and Steve says it's been a failure. There are 5 million people working in the private sector today that weren't working when I was sworn in. The stock market has doubled since I was sworn in. There's been 31 months straight of job growth. I'm not touting this as something that deserves an award, but I'm saying that it's a pretty substantial difference from where we were. If we're going to continue this, though, we are going to continue to work with our distressed homeowners to modify their mortgages, to put them into more affordable situations. Look, the United States public bailed out the banks. To my way of thinking, that gives us a lever to say, when you were flat on your back, when you were going to go bankrupt, the United States taxpayer bailed you out. Now you stretch. You stretch to modify, not 2 million or 3 million mortgages, but 8 million mortgages, and work with the banks to make that happen. If we can fix that housing issue, if we can fix the uncertainty that Americans have about whether they're underwater or not, the growth that we see now in our economy, and we do see growth, it's not to be celebrated, but it's very different than when I first went to Washington, will accelerate.
Mr. Obsitnik.
The answer is jobs. The answer is jobs. The companies I've helped take to Rochester, taking 250 jobs to Rochester. And I want to talk more, hopefully there's a question about that, about why. But that's how you help the housing market. That's how you help people in creating a job. So specifically, government has to create an environment where entrepreneurs and small businesses can survive and thrive. The average age of an entrepreneur in America is 42. 42 years old. That person is probably middle class, has a mortgage, has kids, and does a job and does it really well and wants to leave a business to start something new. So what government has to do is give them 4 things. 1, make sure the cost of doing business doesn't keep them in their business. Dodd-Frank does that, Obamacare does that. It keeps people stationary. It doesn't create job churn and job creation. Second of all, taxation. We need to reform our corporate and individual tax codes so that small business owners aren't penalized anymore. Thirdly, skilled workers. Why I went to Rochester? Kodak was there. Kodak's imploding. A lot of really trained people up there. Fourthly, access to capital. Small Business Administration, which helped my grandfather create his business, and which I served on the National Small Business Advisory Board, has become the Large Business Administration post-stimulus. You can be a 500-person company getting access to SBA money. That's not right. We need SBA money, and I will fight for the SBA for business owners in our state who are starting up, who have $1 million, $2 million, $5 million businesses, not 500-person organizations.
Mr. Himes, 45.
Jobs are essential, but if we have an honest conversation about jobs, there's a limit to what the federal government, or frankly any government, can do to create jobs. Jobs are created by people in the private sector. But what we can do as a government is do what we've always done, which is invest in the infrastructure, the railways, the highways, the bridges, the airports, and the human infrastructure, the education. Half our kids up here in Bridgeport are not graduating from high school. What kind of economic power do you think they will ever have? That's what government can do in the long run. And one of the frustrating things about this last 2 years in the Congress is pretty much everybody agrees with that, but it's been so polarized, and in particular the Republican majority has been so aggressive. They say, sorry, that's not on the table. That's not an answer. And it is a direct torpedo into the heart of our ability to create jobs in this country.
Ken Dixon, your question for Steve Obsitnik.
Let's see, it's a target-rich environment here. What shall we do?
Which one?
Let's talk about the fiscal cliff. What should be done within the next 4 months, 5 months to deal with the fiscal cliff that the country is mostly unaware of?
The fiscal cliff in the next 4 months. Right now, the bipartisanship is not going to solve it in 4 months. Unless there's something miraculous comes through in Washington or in a lame duck session, something changes. I don't see that happening, and Congressman Himes probably has more insight than me if there is something that's going to change it. So what I think we have to do for businesses, and because for me, jobs isn't it is long-term. As Congressman Himes said, all of his solutions are long-term focused. We need immediate-term solutions which help grow our economy, which address this fiscal cliff we're approaching. So specifically, we need to give certainty to job creators, small businesses, and homes to say this Congress has failed on both sides of the aisle. So we need to move forward and set a date by the end of the fiscal year where we can address thoughtful tax reform, spending reform, and put a budget in place. For the first 2 years that Congressman Himes was in Washington, there was no budget. And the priority was health care, not jobs, not fiscal accountability. We exploded our debt and deficits, adding $6 trillion. He was outraged at Congressman Himes, and he said, quote, debt does matter when you ran against him in 2008. Well, now we got 6 more. So now it must really matter, Congressman Himes. And maybe we need to get a third podium up here again to let Congressman Himes debate with candidate Himes about what really matters fiscally.
Mr. Himes.
Well, avoiding the fiscal cliff, of course, is job one right after the election. And frankly, Mr. Obsitnik, you call for bipartisanship, but you take these shots on candidate Himes versus Congressman Himes. For 2 years, since the Simpson-Bowles Commission came out, I have driven hard within the Congress to get people on both sides of the aisle to understand that that's the answer, or something very much like it. It'll be negotiated. We must avoid the fiscal cliff, because if all the tax increases occur and if all the spending cuts occur, we go back into recession, which is an abstract word, but it means hundreds of thousands of American families now being thrown out of work, and that cannot happen. So bipartisan actors will arrive at a deal that looks something like Simpson-Bowles, probably in the first quarter of next year. Now, Mr. Obsitnik mocks me for pointing to awards. I try to bring in third-party validation, because of course, before an election, people say he said, she said. I was presented with the Economic Patriot Award by the Concord Coalition. This is an organization run by Warren Rudman and Sam Nunn. There are probably not statesmen more serious about the future fiscal health of this country than those two individuals. And they awarded me that because it's not an easy vote to take. 9 members of Congress of 435, 9 of 435 voted against their party's budgets and 4 Simpson-Bowles. And I was one of those 9 votes, for which I received this Economic Patriot Award. I take this deadly seriously because it is the solution that fixes the situation, but more importantly, that then says to us we've got the certainty around the tax code, and we've got the certainty about what we will invest in our future, in education, in infrastructure, and the things that will allow our kids to start businesses and prosper.
Mr. Obsitnik, your rebuttal.
Facts are the facts. You can't hide from facts, and just because you don't like the facts doesn't mean that they're not true. 9% unemployment, 43 months, we've been above 8% of the country, $6 trillion more added to our national debt. Patriots to me are on the front line fighting today. Patriots are men and women in Afghanistan. That's what a patriot is. Congressman, you didn't vote for Simpson-Bowles, you voted for Cooper LaTourette. And Chris Van Hollen, your own budget committee chairman, a Democrat, said, quote, Cooper LaTourette is a bait and switch plan. So the only thing I take issue is we don't have time for symbolic votes to show independence when the true record shows very differently.
Patrick Gallagher for Jim Himes.
Let's keep it on the fiscal cliff here. Both of you had said you would support Simpson Bowles. What specific aspects of the Simpson Bowles proposal would you favor should this get pushed into 2013?
Well, first let me clear something up. I've been listening to Mr. Obsitnik use Chris Van Hollen as a critic of Simpson Bowles. Chris Van Hollen was, as leader on the budget committee of the Democrats, is the author of the Democratic budget, which of course was an alternative to Simpson Bowles. So asking Chris Van Hollen, who's a friend of mine, what he thinks of the Simpson Bowles budget is a little like asking a Red Sox fan what he thinks of the Yankees pitching staff. You know, he's going to have a certain point of view on this stuff. And of course, he criticizes Simpson Bowles, and maybe Mr. Obsitnik should clarify this. He criticizes Simpson Bowles because he says it has too many cuts relative to new revenue. That's the Democratic critique, frankly, of Simpson Bowles. And Mr. Obsitnik has embraced that critique, and maybe to the Republicans in the room, he should explain that. But you cannot choose one portion of Simpson Bowles and say, I like this. The concept of Simpson Bowles is the way we solve this problem because everything is on the table. There are no sacred cows. So yes, there's $1 of new revenue to every $3 of cuts. Nothing is spared on the cuts. Defense, non-defense, it's all on the table. That's the only way we get the many associations and lobbyists and interests in Washington who come together to agree to this, to get the Congress to agree to this, because everybody understands that they have sacrificed, that they have helped. That's the only approach that works. And again, Mr. Obsitnik can blame me for $6 trillion in new debt, which we all know is not factual. We know that we inherited a disastrous situation, and he can condemn my advocacy of Simpson Bowles, but it has not been easy to stand in the Congress and say, this is the plan that works, because every aspect of that plan is difficult for somebody.
Mr. Obsitnik?
Names, complexity, everything else. He didn't vote for Simpson Bowles, he voted for Cooper LaTourette, which the Democratic Party chairman said was a bait and switch shell game. We don't have time for symbolic votes. People are hurting. We can't obfuscate the facts of what we're dealing with here. And I'm sorry if I feel like a victim in my probing here, Congressman Himes, because this is so key to how we're going to solve things going forward. We agree on Simpson Bowles. What Simpson Bowles didn't go far enough on was pushing into the largest part of our deficit, Medicare. And that's one part which was glazed over in the effort of getting to a lot of bipartisanship, because I think people in Washington know that we need to drive to even more stronger bipartisan solutions around Medicare, given it's important to our health care and our parents, and it's on a path to being insolvent in 12 years.
Rebuttal?
We Presbyterians have an ethnic term. It's called chutzpah. Chutzpah is pointing at the president and a Democratic Congress and handing them an economy spiraling into depression, and then doing everything over 4 years to make sure that nothing, not even the tax cuts that are religiously important to you, get passed in the Congress, saying no to absolutely everything, and then 4 years later saying, you didn't do enough. Oh, and by the way, the crowning chutzpah is, we got to go back to what got us into this in the first place, because the answer is clearly widespread regulation, more. That's pretty clear from the
We've talked about plenty of
I entered